ladies and gentlemen, we got with us tonight the distinct honor of having Noah Smith, Bloomberg columnist, with us. He's a Bloomberg opinion columnist. He was assistant professor of finance at Stony Brook University, blogs at No Opinion, and he writes about economics, tweets about rabbits, and I mean, gosh, seems like you read about all kinds of stuff, really.
Yeah, I have a new blog.
Yeah.
The blog is back.
You've joined the Substack revolution.
That's right. I like it. It handles the email for you. You know, people can subscribe if they want. Yeah.
Very cool.
So it's fun.
Yeah. So I read an article of yours recently that really, made me really want to talk to you because you said federal deficits don't work like credit cards. And I guess what I'm curious about is, it's all well and good to say that the federal government doesn't have to, it's not a household. It doesn't have the same limits that maybe you or I as individuals have with respect to spending. But at some point, the debt train has to come to an end, right? I mean, we can't just go into deeper and deeper debt forever, can we?
Well, okay. So let's walk through what happens if we do.
Yeah.
Let's do a little mental experiment. Suppose that the government just says, I'm going to borrow a crap ton of money and just keep increasing it and just borrow, however much, just keep increasing the deficit by bazillions and bazillions. All right. What happens?
Yeah. I mean, eventually the interest payments start to climb.
Interest payments. All right. Yeah. So then the government who's borrowing all this money calls up the Fed and says, hey, Fed.
Yeah.
Buy all the bonds so that the interest rate goes to zero and stays at zero forever. So we never have to pay any interest payment ever again. And the Fed says, yes, sir. And the Fed buys up all the bonds on the market. And it doesn't have to buy the bonds directly from the Treasury. It can just wait for banks to buy them and then buy them directly from the banks. And so it does this, and then it lowers interest rates to zero and keeps them there forever. Then what happens?
Well, I mean, in that process, we're continually creating more and more money to pay for those bonds, right?
Are we?
I mean,
so when the Fed buys bonds, what the Fed does is it exchanges reserves for bonds, right? Actually, if the reserves have an interest rate of, I don't know, 0.25% or whatever, and the bonds have an interest rate of 0.25%, then it's exchanging one 0.25% interest rate instrument for another one. So it's crediting, it's giving reserves to the banks give it the bonds. What's happening? Are we printing money?
Well, I guess the thing is that this seems like, intuitively, somebody like me who's not an economist, but who is interested in this, it seems like what you're talking about is too good to be true. I mean, it reminds me of the promises of the modern monetary theory folks, who say, look,
exactly the promises of the modern monetary theory folks. That's what this is.
Yeah.
That's exactly what this is.
Yeah, but I mean, is this something that only the United States can do? I mean, why can't Greece do this, for example? I mean, why are they suffering austerity and having to go hat in hand asking for debt relief, while apparently we in the United States will never have such a concern, no matter how much debt we accrue.
So, all right. So here's what actually I think happens. It's good to go through this thought experiment, because instead of just sort of balking at it and saying, oh God, this can't keep going on forever, something's got to break. It's good to think about actually what would break.
Yeah.
So the first thing that happens is banks are like, okay, we're not doing this anymore. And then the Fed has to step in and basically say, all right, banks, we'll make you a deal. You buy the Treasury bonds as soon as they issue them, and then tomorrow we'll buy them from you. So the bank's like, okay, I can do that. I'll hold the bonds for like a day or 5 minutes, who knows, whatever. And then technically the Fed isn't buying from the Treasury, but effectively they are. So then they do that. And so basically this goes on until at some point people are like, this is going to cause inflation.
Right.
This is going to cause inflation if it keeps going. And then if you think that there's going to be a big inflation, what do? You raise prices ahead of time. And you get your money out of the country, because inflation will devalue your money. And so you get your money out of the country and you raise prices, and these things cause inflation. So if enough people suspect that inflation is about to result from this, they will make it happen. It'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then it's effectively a default on the debt, and your economy gets wrecked, and you suck, and you're Venezuela. So that is what happens in the question. There's two questions. Question number one, why do they start to suspect that there's going to be inflation from this? What would make them wake up and say, I'm scared now that this can't go on. This is going to cause inflation. And so that's the first question. The second question is, does it happen slowly and gradually and give the government time to cut this out and reverse course? Mm-hmm. Or does it happen all at once overnight, and one day you're at 2% inflation, you're like, there's no inflation. And the next day you're like, blah, you know, and then what happened? Like, does it happen slow or fast? And in Venezuela, it happened slow. There were like a couple years of elevated inflation, and it kept creeping up and creeping up and creeping up, and they did nothing. Mm-hmm. And then it exploded. Mm-hmm. And so you can kind of tell. And that's, so the question is, does that always happen? Do we always get the warning that we need? If we don't, in other words, if it, you know, it's like an invisible pit. You're walking forward, you know, the pit's somewhere around here, but you're like, well, okay, is there a little incline before the pit, and I can pull back and go, oh my God, pit? Or is it just going to be a straight sheer wall? And I go, you know, and so that's the question.
Well, here's something else that gets me in about, you know, for example, this is something I've thought about with the MMT situation is they'll say, well, look, once inflation worries kick in, hey, we don't have to worry. We can just raise taxes, or we can do other things to control inflation. But it seems to me that is sort of a false promise, because you're saying then, okay, once people start to worry here about what their economic fortunes may look like, then let's tax them. I mean, that seems like you're relying on political will to stop this machine, and I don't know if that's something that we can, you know, rely on.
That's a really big question.
Like,
so the question
seems to be relevant to the debt question too. I mean,
we have an independent central bank, mm-hmm. in part because the independent central bank is supposed to raise interest rates when the economy has high inflation, even though it's going to be unpopular with the people. Mm-hmm. It's this unpopular but necessary medicine is the idea behind independent central banking. However, fiscal policy is not independent. I mean, we can make it independent. We can make like some sort of fiscal authority, endow it with a bunch of money, and let it be like the Fed. Mm-hmm. But probably we will never do that. So instead, it's going to be Congress. Mm-hmm. Congress moves slow and stupid, and sometimes doesn't move at all and gets deadlocked and is much more subject to political whims than an independent. You know, there's problems with independent central banks. They're not truly independent. Mm-hmm. They can make mistakes, blah, blah, blah. They care about the wrong things. Right. That's a problem. But Congress, we know, has, you know, major issues getting its ass in gear. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're in the middle of this giant pandemic. They won't even pass another relief bill. So the question is, can they pull back from that pit? Suppose we see inflation start to rise 6%, 8%, whatever. And then we're like, guys, 12%. And then we're like, guys, and Congress is like, 12%, you know, who cares? And then, or maybe like they just argue over the details of the bill and blah, blah. And then while they're doing that every day, it's ticking up and then boom. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the fear. And that's why we don't understand how fast inflation comes or why it comes when it comes. Mm-hmm. And until we understand that, I think we've got to be wary of pursuing this, you know, MMT style strategy. Mm-hmm. Even if it means, I mean, sometimes we're stupid. Like we've often erred on the side of austerity. Mm-hmm. We've often erred on the side of, as soon as anyone at the Fed just starts to get worried, like, oh my gosh, so much debt, or like some Wall Street Journal article is like that. Then we pull back. Yeah. You know, and that's, you know, the biggest austerity people were Democrats. Like, you know, Obama was constantly worrying about the deficit. Bill Clinton was a big deficit hawk. And so there's this idea that Republicans are the deficit hawks, but they're sort of opportunistic deficit hawks. Mm-hmm. When the Democrats are in power, Republicans want to cut the deficit. Sure. But the Democrats want to cut the deficit effectively all the time. They worry all the time about deficits, even when they're in power. You know, they want to, and so you know, there's a strong argument that we've been too pro austerity, mm-hmm. and now it's time to you know, open the taps more, and that we've erred on the side of austerity too much. But then the question is it even worth thinking about whether too much is too much, and whether there's that invisible sort of pit out there?
what I'm curious about is, I mean, we've had, historically, now I guess now for the last, well, I guess since the Reagan years, generally stable, predictable inflation in the United States for the most part. But before before, I think the Fed chairman was Paul Volcker, I think.
Before Volcker?
He was the chairman.
Volcker stopped inflation. He
Yes,
raised interest rates really high to stop inflation. You're
right.
thinking of Arthur Burns.
Yeah, I'm saying before Volcker, we had these,
Yeah.
really high inflation rates of 12, 14%. And what I worry about is, it seems like this is a problem that now seems very far in the past, in the rearview mirror, that many people haven't had any personal experience with. But when I look at what life was like at the time, these high inflation rates really were, I mean, they were ruinous. I mean, I just signed a 2.75% mortgage, and I'm thinking, how were people existing on mortgage rates of 12 and 13% back in the 1980s? I mean, it's crazy.
Well, I mean, so the idea theoretically
Mm-hmm.
is that if you can get wages to go up right along with inflation, you're fine.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is that time they did not. And if you look at wages, it just it just doesn't even notice the inflation, and then the inflation is like, "Ah," and so then wages take a dive. In the 70s, if you look at the era of high inflation, real wages just cratered,
Mm-hmm.
and that represents the big separation of the classes. I think working class people really took a hit at that time because their wages just couldn't keep up with inflation. And economists like to think that whenever real wage that workers and employers and blah blah, they take inflation into account, but it looks like they kind of don't.
Let me ask you one more question about debt here. So the most common refrain, or maybe not the most common refrain, but one of the most common cries is not just that we owe this massive national debt, but that it is owed to China and Japan. And this is presented as a big geopolitical threat. And I gotta say, I've tried to figure out, I'm tempted to ask very, skeptical questions on this, but I can't figure out even a skeptical argument for this because it seems like at the end of the day, the United States is at no risk of having foreign debt holders so long as it continues to pay its debt. And even in the scenario where it didn't, I mean, that it doesn't seem like they are any more of a risk to us than a domestic debt holder who we didn't pay. They don't seem to present a different risk, but is there any merit to treating that debt as different?
Probably not. Probably not. But I mean, I guess for devil's advocacy,
Yeah.
The scary thing, the time that inflation happens is basically when people start dumping dollar assets and getting all their money out of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Because effectively it's a run on the dollar. Hyperinflation is a crash in the price of the dollar. And so a run on an asset will cause its price to crash. And so if everyone gets their money out of the country and just doesn't want dollar assets, you'll get inflation. And so the question is the specter of capital flight. There is an argument that these foreign investors will be more quick than domestic investors to flee. That one day China will completely dump, and then Japan will completely dump, and then maybe Americans will say, okay, they're dumping, I better dump too, and that'll precipitate the crisis. So you did have a situation where, it didn't cause hyperinflation, but you had a situation where, Soros short of the pound. That's kind of a famous, or during the Asian financial crisis, you had these things where basically the foreign investors all stampeded out of the country really quickly. Of course, this is much worse if you borrow in a foreign currency, which is a bad idea, because then you can't use exchange rate policy. But anyway, so there's this idea that if you had this catastrophe, maybe it could be triggered by these foreign investors. To be honest, I don't think that's a big deal because we saw China in like 2015 dump a ton of treasuries, like $1 trillion, and then domestic investors snapped it up and rates didn't even rise. It was nothing.
Oh wow. Okay. So that could be some risk. Do you think there could ever be one more question on this, just as a follow-up?
Sure.
Do you think there's any situation where I guess China could choose to dump it to dump all their holdings, even if it would be a real loss for them, purely to cause some kind of chaos in our markets? I mean, is that a risk at all?
It's going to cause maybe, but it almost certainly wouldn't work. They'd have to get the timing extremely right. Otherwise, they just hurt themselves.
Okay.
They'd have to like really pick their spot, because all the other investors would have to sort of follow them, not just Japan or whoever else holds our debt, like all those countries, but also U.S. domestic investors would have to follow them at the same time.
Yeah.
So they'd have to basically, it's like doing a short, right? It's like if it doesn't work, that they're just going to screw themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. So it's pretty unlikely, and even if it were to happen, it would have to be super well timed for it to really.
I'm not worried. Of course, like our foreign debt percent has gone from like whatever 15 to 30 or something like that. So if it gets really high, and it's like U.S. investors basically have no appetite for U.S. debt, and it's all just these foreigners who could bolt at any time. Yeah, a little more worried. 30%, not yet worried.
Okay. And I know that I mentioned China, but I think China holds somewhere between 10 and 15 on its own. So it's not, it's not as if to say that a third or 30% of the debt is all China. It's only a share of that. Okay. Well, let me ask you this. I want to ask you a follow-up question about wages. Because you mentioned those and how workers took a real hit in the 1970s during that inflationary period. Something that I know we have commonly heard since that period, or at least recently about that period, is that real wages have not risen in about 40 years. And I want to ask you, first of all, is that claim basically correct?
No. So what people are doing is people are looking at a specific time series called average hourly earnings of production and non-supervisory workers. So what happened is that companies started paying a lot of in-kind benefits. They started paying like pension matching and healthcare is the big one, and then a whole bunch of stuff. You can say, well, $1 of healthcare isn't worth as much as $1 of dollar. We could have that argument. I don't know. Some people say, yeah, it's the same. You'd have to buy healthcare anyway, and it would cost you even more if you bought it on your own, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. So we could have that argument. But I think the point is that compensation went up. And that never fell. It stagnated for a while. But it's also true. So it's also true that compensation has grown a lot more slowly in recent decades than it did in the golden decades of the post-war up till early mid 1970s. And so, yeah, there has been a slowdown. It's just not like this dramatic fall and then rise that you see with this one series.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
also that series classifies people as it depends heavily on who's classified as production and non-supervisory. So if you reclassify everyone as a supervisor except for the very lowest wage workers, you have this composition effect where that thing falls. And to be honest, we didn't collect good enough data back before the 80s to really know whether that was a big deal. So I'm sure there's some research that someone has done to figure this out. I just don't know it. But that's another reason why that talking point where you see this giant wage decline is
okay.
It's way overblown, but there has been a slowdown. No doubt there's been a slowdown.
And so but just to be clear, it sounds like you're saying that much of the increase has not been in terms of like the dollars you take home. It's been in the benefits in the benefit package that goes along with your pay. Like a lot of what might have been perhaps wage increases have been kind of devoured by the rising cost of healthcare. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
That is absolutely fair to say. That happened.
That because I guess what I'm curious about is that it seems like when folks are talking about how wages have been stagnant in this country for a long time, it seems to be sort of a not just the issue you mentioned where it's been a slowdown, not a stagnation, but it seems like our sort of dysfunctional healthcare system is basically eating up a lot of gains that workers might otherwise make.
Yes, that is happening.
Okay.
So that's in it. Healthcare is the worst. Everyone knows it's the worst offender here, but it's not the only one. Recently, rent has sort of joined the party. Yeah. In terms of eating up people's paychecks, childcare is huge. Childcare is like as bad as healthcare. It's just less of an expense total, but it's still big. Childcare, healthcare, college education has risen less than people think, but it's still risen. Rent has risen less than people think, but it still has risen. And so these things all together add up, these excess costs. But healthcare and childcare, like those are the worst offenders.
Well, so let me ask you this. I know you were, you were elected chief neoliberal shill in a, so it's, really,
In 2018.
Really an honor to talk to a chief neoliberal shill. We had Scott Lincecum on a little while back, so this is...
Did you get Iglesias? He was the other shill.
Oh, man, well, we'll have to complete the trifecta soon. Maybe you can...
You got to get Iglesias, that's right. All the shills.
Yeah. But so I'm curious then, we talk a lot like on this channel about rent and the problem with the housing supply is basically zoning and not grubby, greedy landlords, but basically homeowners who chiefly want to defend their property values. And
it's not just that,
Well, what I want to ask you two things. First of all, why is it that that housing costs have gone, I guess, through the roof, as it were? And yeah, so I guess that's the first thing I want to ask you.
It is regulation. Zoning's only a part of it, and it is to raise property values, but that's only a small part of it, I think. Because density actually increases property values. You get a bunch of economic activity in the area, your house price will actually go up. So it's not so. That's less of a deal than people think. However, what am I saying? No, it's to keep out poor people, especially poor Black people. That is why this is done. So this is, people used to say that the American national pastime was baseball, and then I think they switched to sex, and at all those times they were wrong. At all those times, the American national pastime was keeping poor people out of your neighborhood.
Well, let me ask you. I guess what I am curious about is, I mean, well, I don't want to ask why. Maybe how are people doing this? Is it the same rules? And you're saying it's the motive is not the motive isn't property value. It's those same rules you're talking about.
The property value thing's a euphemism because we don't just want to start a culture war every time we talk about this policy. But it's so what's happening is, so it's, zoning's a piece of it. Construction costs are super high in part because of delays. So basically you can always appeal anything. So if your neighbor is building something, you're like, are you sure you've got the environmental thing right? And you stop construction for 6 months. There's ridiculous like height restrictions, building code restrictions, parking minimums, all these kind of things. And the insane appeals process, the fact that you don't have as of right construction in a lot of places, these things add up, and there's a lot more things too. And so when some places have eliminated single family zoning, what happens is the local places just add a bunch of parking minimums and setbacks and height restrictions and things and building codes until basically it equals the same thing it was before, and you kill the whole effect. So it's this massive thicket of restrictions, and the local politics people are just on it every day, every meeting. They come to all the meetings. There's like some research showing that like almost all the people who show up to these meetings are like homeowners. Like renters don't even show up, and of course potential renters in some other city can't show up. That makes no sense. And so and that's the big problem. You need this to be solved at least at the state level, maybe at the federal level.
So you think it's basically not possible because
not with local politics. Everyone wants to keep the poor people away.
Is there, out of curiosity, has anybody done research showing definitively, or at least suggesting very convincingly, that no, the motive is primarily poor people? It really is the property value.
There's historical research.
Yeah. I mean, because I don't mean like, I know historically that has certainly been a thing, but I mean like even now, Like,
is there research showing that like that's the big motivation right now?
Yeah. Or at least, I guess I'm just curious because I had thought
it's hard to do that research.
Yeah.
Like you have to. It's not easy to figure out how to figure that out. You'd have to. That's for political scientists. And so I don't know the political science literature that much, but the guy to ask is a guy named Jason McDaniel. He'll know this.
All right. I'm sure.
It's sort of one of those open secret things we all know, and like occasionally they slip up and say the truth.
Yeah.
Like when that guy said Cupertino guy said, build a wall around San Jose, build the wall around San Jose.
Yeah.
What do you think you're talking about?
I know. I'm curious though, because I guess when I get these arguments, it's nice to know that maybe I get a little more ammunition about it. That's
right. Here's the thing. Like, nobody wants to, I mean, people don't want to live in like a neighborhood filled with poor people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to 100% tell them you're stupid. Mm-hmm. Go live in an 80% poor neighborhood.
Yeah.
However, if every neighborhood had affordable housing in it, mm-hmm. poor people are spread out, and you don't have to live in an 80% poor neighborhood. You live in a 10% poor neighborhood or something, and it's not bad. Like, having some poor neighbors is not bad. So, but the problem is that it's a coordination problem. No town wants to be number one. No town wants to be the first.
Oh, I see.
To do that, they don't want to be the first to allow the poor people into their town, because they think that it's going to be a stampede and everyone else is going to say, yes, take them. And then, so people want to so anyway, it's this coordination problem. And that's another reason why state or federal action is so important.
And so something I'm curious about, like what kind of state or federal action? Like I had thought maybe, one example might be, I don't know, a state that gets a lot of highway money, maybe as a condition of getting this highway money.
Oh, for federal?
Given that, I think you can make a very clear connection between, density and highway.
The problem is that, the problem is that the federal government just doesn't have much jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So it has to do it through things like what you just described. Mm-hmm. Basically carrots, not sticks.
Yeah.
State can just say, as of right building, no single family zoning, restrictions on parking minimums, setbacks, and height restrictions. Bam, done.
And when you say as of right building, I haven't heard that term.
That means that if the code says you can build here, then you don't have to go through a long permitting process to build. Right. You just say, guess what? I own this property. The code says I can build it. I'm building.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah,
And so the question is this is pretty decisive government intervention in local politics. And do you want to call that neoliberal or not? I don't know. So it's central government intervention in the service of deregulation.
Yeah. And that's I think an idea that's probably hard for a lot of folks to wrap their heads around. But,
right. They're wait a second, local control. your government is interfering in my local control. And it feels like this government interference. And the government is like, we're canceling your local government intervention with the state government intervention. So the question is that big government, or is that small government?
It's interesting you say that. There's this quote, this G.K. Chesterton quote, where he says something to the effect of the more local the government, the better, the purer it is, or it's more honest, it's pure, it's better. And I really butchered the quote. But the big idea there, I guess that it's kind of frustrating, the idea that local is always better, because it comes with its own set of issues, like namely you mentioned. There on a lot of local issues, there's a group of super committed busybodies who show up to everything and who make it a point to be super involved, and it makes it really hard for an ordinary working person to get equal representation in government, because they can't show up to every meeting the way these professional activist types do. And I've seen that working in the utility business, where these utility folks, they never ever miss a meeting, and so it's local citizens just really they don't have a chance. Okay, so that's rent. What about healthcare? I mean, what kind of model for healthcare reform do you personally favor?
I have a great model. And so the model, first of all, we have to recognize that all the people on the right who are what we actually need is a free market in healthcare, are advocating, first of all, a radical experiment that's not like anything that's ever been tried on this earth. And B, is in the direction of the parts of our system that are a problem, away from the systems that we know work better than ours. However, but the people who, are really leading the charge toward universal healthcare, I think they've got some problems with their plans, like Bernie. So for example, they eliminate the private insurance industry. There's no role for private insurance. Everybody has the same insurance. There's so you can't buy something better. And that means that, maybe you can't, maybe that would stifle innovation because you couldn't have these rich people paying for, fancy newfangled hip resurfacing treatments that in 5 years will then be available en masse because you have a learning curve. Your healthcare system probably benefits from having rich people buy some better, newer stuff that then goes down in price because of the learning curve, right? So there's that problem. There's the problem of like, it's just going to be super expensive. I mean, these guys, of course, assume that they can either tax or deficit spend as much as they want. Probably a bad assumption. And so the bill's probably too high for Bernie's plan. And there's not really cost sharing. So we have these problem of, I mean, our healthcare system is actually like, its quality is pretty average. And for rich people, it's great. For normal people, it's pretty average in terms of international systems. The problem is that it costs twice as much.
Yeah, that seems to be, there are a couple of areas where we're better, a couple of areas where we're worse, like overall. But that does seem to be the big difference is the costs, even in
costs so
yeah,
much.
Yeah.
And so we need to get down those costs because otherwise they're going to seep through somehow. Like the costs are going to either, result in higher premiums, higher out-of-pocket costs, denials of coverage, these weird, stupid surprise bills, or higher payroll taxes. I mean, or whatever. Like the costs are going to eat through, and so we need to bring down those costs. And so the question is, how do we do that? And your libertarian people will just be like, free market in healthcare. They don't really know what that means. They'll just like say, they'll just like randomly point to stuff. Oh, we don't have enough doctors. Well, I agree, we don't have enough doctors, but it's not a big deal. Like doctor salaries aren't even that big a piece of the healthcare cost thing at all. Like, and so these guys are just throwing up anything they can, any chaff, any like, just like taking any junk they have in the car and throwing it at the car chasing them. It's just like last ditch attempt to avoid universal health insurance. It's shameful. They should stop because all the countries that actually do health insurance well, have national health insurance system or some really fancy ass Germany style substitute that ends up being like Obamacare plus, which ends up being the same thing. And so if you look at the systems I think are best, the systems that don't spend much money, get good outcomes, and those are the systems of like Japan and South Korea. I think that the Asian countries got this one right.
Yeah.
And then and so what they do is they basically you pay some out-of-pocket costs. So you'll pay like, unless you're poor or like really old. If you're really old, you don't pay, and if you're poor, you don't pay. But if so there's means testing there. But they have basically for most people pay something like 25-30% out of pocket. Now that out of pocket cost is big, and you can also have a secondary insurance for that, and that's private insurance. So these countries do have private insurance systems to supplement their national health insurance universal system. And so they have universal health insurance, national health insurance, and then a private system on top of that. Some of it's employer based, some of it's just you pay it out of pocket, whatever. And then some people don't get it and they just pay the 30% out of pocket. And so that's that. And so the other thing is that they control prices really well because they just cartelize. They have all the hospitals and doctors get together in a council and say, here's how much we'll pay. And it's monopsony, right? Yeah. It's monopsony bargaining power. You have this big cartelized purchasers combine, trust that basically says it bargains the price down.
Well, let me ask you a couple things about that.
We can do all this overnight with a system we already have.
Really?
Yes.
How so?
It's called Medicare. And the problem is that Bernie took the word Medicare for all and turned it into some bullshit thing. What actually, if you take the actually existing Medicare, just cover everybody with it.
Right.
It looks really much like the Japanese and Korean systems because you have the cost sharing and the private supplement. I mean, that's Medicare, right? And then the Medicare system itself can negotiate those prices down. It has the authority to negotiate those prices down. Already Medicare gets much cheaper costs for the same services relative to private insurers. That won't change. And so in other words, we can get a close facsimile of the Japanese and Korean system overnight just by giving everyone Medicare.
Wow. So by literally doing Medicare for all, not by
Right.
turning Medicare into a state sort of monopoly program,
Right.
we can get something approaching what they do in Japan and South Korea, which have great health outcomes, great expense or great
It's great.
cost control. I don't know if they're
Yep.
the lowest or not, but they're pretty low.
Yeah.
And
Like Korea's the lowest. Korea and
is it?
Singapore, that's the lowest.
Okay, wow. So
Singapore's richer than us. Singapore is a lot richer than us.
and
And their consumption, in PPP terms is higher, and their healthcare as a percent of GDP is like 5%. Ours is 17.
wow. Well, I mean,
Singapore is just like cost down.
yeah.
And it happens. And Korea is really good too. Japan is pretty good.
Is all of this really a mirage? Is all of this even possible in a world where where the United States is playing by the same system? I mean, doesn't our system through its enormous cost bankroll the health industry of the world? Aren't American customers? How? I mean, American customers paying so much for medicines and technologies and. No, I mean we're paying these big companies. We don't have that kind of negotiating power that say hospitals in Japan and doctors in Japan have. Instead, and in fact, if I recall, Medicare isn't even allowed really to negotiate prices.
They're not allowed to negotiate drug prices.
Okay.
They do negotiate normal prices for normal stuff. And if you look at various people have gone and looked at the service, the price of Medicare and like other insurers private insurers pay for standardized services. Medicare is like here, and the private insurer is like, okay. And so it's a big difference. So they do it manifestly works. It absolutely works. The question, when you say, are we bankrolling other countries?
I mean, by virtue of the fact that we are paying so much for our health care, I mean, is all of that basically just administrative waste? Or, if you're
administrative waste, but I think only the advocates of universal health care who claim that there's a lot of administrative waste to be saved I doubt that it's nearly as much as they think.
Yeah. I guess what
I think that's, but I think it's all the monopsony. It's all just the bargaining. It's all just squeezing the inefficiencies out of the providers, like squeezing basically just making them provide care more efficiently for the cost.
Well, what about, and again, I'm just curious here, like what about research and development? Like a company that creates a new drug. And they then have the prospect of selling that drug to recoup their costs. I mean, it seems like a lot of people, again, it just seems like the American market represents an opportunity to recoup a lot of costs by comparison to these other markets that are much better about controlling costs. And I don't know. I mean, does the healthcare industry depend on our system being so costly?
So the idea here is that by paying for innovation, we pay for ideas that then leak across borders.
Yes.
That's this idea. That is not what most of healthcare is, by the way. Most of healthcare is the administration of things that are not innovative at all. It's the same old shit. So most of the costs that we would squeeze out of the system are not things that go to pay for innovation. And thus, no, substantively, we're not bankrolling these other countries. Okay. However, because it's just most of it's not innovation. Yeah. However, we do want to make sure the innovation continues. That said, we want to make sure that innovation continues. One way is if you don't do the Bernie plan and you just give everyone Medicare, then the rich people will be able to subsidize fancy schmancy stuff, and that will be some incentive to innovation. So if you look at plastic surgery, right? There's been tremendous innovation in plastic surgery. It's real cheap too. Rich people pay for it. Poor people don't get plastic surgery, I hope. Please let them not be getting plastic surgery. But rich people do, and that's been enough to fund innovation, just the rich people. And so, but the promise, so for drug discovery, you do want the promise of profits down the road. Drug discovery is a problem. Even with our current system, drug discovery is slowing down. Slowed down a lot, and the costs for drug discovery have risen. The answer is that that's probably specific to the pharmaceutical industry and that I don't really know about it. It might have to do with like onerous FDA regulations. It might have to do with changes in technology. It might have to do with the way the patent system works. And so I've seen these arguments and I'm not equipped to tell which is right.
Okay.
Unless I did a deep dive and spent months looking into it. But point being, our national health insurer won't just control costs. when applicable, it will be able to incentivize innovation. We just have to make sure that it knows to do that.
Okay, makes sense. So we've figured out rent, we figured out healthcare, and the other two big drivers of costs are college and childcare.
Right.
So let me ask you this. This is something I've been real curious about. There are various discussions about what to do with student debt. And you know, I guess you can talk about forgiving it all or forgiving some part of it or forgiving none of it. But whatever you do, whatever degree of regressive benefit or not you decide on, it seems like none of that really does anything about the cost of college. Do you have any thoughts on costs of education? What we can do to make that less, the cost side of it less onerous? Is it just the availability of student loans that drives up the cost of education?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
It's not just that.
Yeah.
There's many explanations for why the cost of college has risen. But if you look at the net tuition that's paid, mm-hmm. it has risen a lot less than people think. Mm-hmm. Because what's happened is that colleges have begun to price discriminate. So what they're doing is they're really milking the rich people and they're giving the money to the poor students. This creates a perverse incentive because it means rich people become a profit center, poor people become a cost center. We've had big increases in costs. Administrative costs, I do believe, are a problem. Some people claim it's not, but after looking at the data, I'm pretty sure it is. Mm-hmm. Just hiring a lot of administrators. Faculty salaries have gone up and staff salaries have gone up too. I mean, there's Baumol's cost disease, but that explains some of it. Land costs have been big. So a lot of what the increase has been like room and board. Huh. So room and board has really gone up. Textbooks are a monopoly that needs to be just crushed. I mean,
so
students
crazy.
Should not have to. Textbooks should cost 1/10 of what they do.
Yeah, I remember like how expensive they were, and it's crazy that this is such a big driver of costs.
Yeah, it's just stupid. So then, anyway, point being, there's lots of reasons for this. Mm-hmm. So offering government subsidized loans is a problem. Mm-hmm. That pumps up the cost. Mm-hmm. It just gets passed through to colleges,
right?
Because 18-year-olds are dumb. They're like, okay, if the government's giving this cheap loan, I'm fine paying more for this college. I can go to this high tuition college. I'll just take out a cheap loan. And young people they don't plan ahead that well. They just sort of have this faith that college will deliver them a great career. And when it doesn't, they're like, I'm going to go online and shitpost for communism. And it's like, ultimately, this.
Are you telling me you wouldn't shitpost for communism if you couldn't get a good? No.
I would shitpost for communism just because I had nothing else to do and made an alt account. For all you know, I have a communist alt that I use to troll my main account.
That's the way to go. Inside job. So what do we do about these costs then?
With college?
Yeah.
Well, one thing we can do is shift to income-based repayment. Mm-hmm. So that if we have income-based repayment, that provides colleges an incentive to make sure that they provide value for money, and then we can.
Well, just to be actually now that I'm curious, what do you mean exactly by income-based repayment? Do you mean like a share, like your repayment is based on, I guess,
how much you make, how much money you make?
What I'm curious about though is
we have some of that already.
We have some of that, so I guess how does that change?
So what changes is that colleges take part of that cut. So essentially, it's colleges buy equity in you. That's what we can do to give colleges an incentive to keep costs down and value up.
I see. Okay, that's what I was curious about because right now, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, I'm just saying if colleges hire a shit ton of administrators and build fancy new dorms and charge you a bunch that you never paid back, they're on the hook.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about because I'm on an income-based repayment program. That's like what it's called, and they take a certain share of your income, and it doesn't go above that. But it also, like the college already got paid, a while back, so they don't care. But in the system,
someone else, the government or somebody shoulders the risk. Mm-hmm. You make college take some of the risk onto their books. Mm-hmm. They will change.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
It's just market solution. Look at that. Market solution, neoliberalism.
But
all the socialists are calling for this. Socialists just want I mean, like socialists really just want the federal government to fund college and turn it into like public school. But um, that's a bad idea. College shouldn't be just more years of public school. Like public school is wasteful enough as it is. I think we should get rid of senior year.
Yeah.
In high school. I think people should graduate college and become legal adults at 17. How about that?
Sounds good to me.
And drinking age and voting age.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've had a lot of debates about what should the voting age be and all that, and somebody always comes charging in and saying, well, your brain isn't developed until you're 25, so basically you shouldn't be voting until you are 25. That's my big idea.
But that's silly because young people have to bear so many more of the consequences of policy.
Exactly. I mean, it's like, you've only got so many years in this life. You can't just ask people to
I mean, we could give people extra votes for having kids. I think Matt Bruning would like that. He would probably like more votes for people with kids.
Another tier of the family fun pack, right?
I know. How's that for pronatalism?
There you go. Well, Matt Bruning.
Anyway, colleges. So there's other things we can do. Community college should be free because ultimately the reason why we want college tuition at all is because colleges need ways to fund their research activities when there's downturns in state funding. And so but community college doesn't do that, so they don't need that. So like a lot of lower tier schools we can just make free. Although actually, to be honest, for lower income people going to lower ranked schools, the big cost is not tuition. By far, the cost is room and board, and the opportunity cost of not getting some random job. So that's not as easy a solution as I make it out to seem right there. We can give things like Pell Grants. We can just expand the Pell Grant program to give more money to the lower income people. It's like means testing, right? It's like means testing.
Makes sense. So, you mentioned socialism, and that's one thing I kind of want to ask you about before we get to get to some questions. And folks, if you have questions, get them ready. We'll ask
people are
them
going to
about
call
5
in.
minutes, right? Well, I wasn't going to take calls, although if you want, we could do that.
Yeah, we can take calls if you want, or whatever you want.
All right, yeah, we can try.
Oh wait,
that.
are people going to text the questions?
Yeah, usually what happens is they type them out because
right,
the thing is I can control that. I cannot control what people will say on the stream in advance. And so,
let's do the typing.
All right. But
socialism.
Let me ask you about this generally, some kind of, I guess, higher level stuff. How do you feel about the rise of sort of, I guess, sympathy for interest in socialism generally? I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of concerning to me, but on the other hand, I understand it as people feel like they are being squeezed by a lot of what we've discussed tonight, a lot of the problems we've discussed tonight. They say, screw this capitalist, nonsense. Let's go with government.
Right.
Does any of that bother you? Do you think it's a phase? Do you think it's, the start of a new direction, for
I think
this generation?
On one hand, it's just pendulum. It's like we swung to the right economically, if not necessarily socially, but we swung to the right economically, in the late 70s and 80s, and we sort of stayed there. We didn't really have much of a left in this country for a long time in terms of economic policy. We had a center left, but we didn't have a real left. Yeah. And but we did have a real right. And the real right, they wanted to slash and burn everything. They wanted to cancel Social Security. Whatever. But there was no real left. And the people who said there's no real left in America in terms of economic stuff were right for many years. They're no longer right. We now have one. And so it's sort of restored balance to the force. We need now we have a real left. Wage stagnation went on a long time. People got screwed in the Great Recession. Like this was coming. Yeah. This was coming. And a lot of the things that some of the things that people are pushing are like too much, and some of the things are like, yeah, why not? That's good. I think that I like the SOC Dems, the Social Democrats. Right. I like them the best. So like JDC Medlock. Yeah, he's great. Those people are my favorite people. But I mean, there's people in socialists pushing some of the same stuff. The problem that I've had with the socialist movement, there were two big problems I've had with the socialist movement. 3. Okay. Among the many, so problems I have with the socialist movement include, number one, there's this extreme obsession with like inside baseball politics and factionalism within the Democratic Party. And Bernie, of course, embodied that when he said, the Democratic establishment can't stop us. He was running as like anti-establishment guy.
Right.
And that was something he said when he was winning. Like he wasn't an outsider anymore. He was winning at that point. And so like this sort of this obsession with like what position like Neera Tanden gets, or like, you know, this obsession with like, guys, the smoke-filled room has been gone for half a century. Like this doesn't exist anymore. And like this factionalism, this obsession with like power. I mean, like Nate Robinson, you know, he's a good guy. But
can you really say that there's no like smoke-filled room? I mean, Joe Biden was running in what, 4th place, and then suddenly he wins South Carolina. Everybody drops out and consolidates around him, and you're saying there was no room where people got together and said, "Hey, we can't have this Bernie guy." You know, I mean, did that not happen?
Sure. No, I mean that absolutely happened, but it's not like. But the point is that this actual smoke-filled room was when they decide who won.
Yeah.
In this case, nobody twisted the Buttigieg voters' arms and made them go for Biden.
Mm-hmm.
No one twisted, you know, who else dropped out? There was Bloomberg voters, all 3 of them. No one. Who else was like sort of big and dropped out right then?
I think Amy Klobuchar.
Oh, Klobuchar and Warren. Warren was already pretty down to pretty toast by then.
Yeah.
But all these people, like nobody twisted the arms of these voters, and there were a lot of undecided voters too, by the way.
Yeah.
So nobody twisted the arms of these voters and made them go for Biden. The smoke-filled room, you could select the president. This time you can select who drops out, but you can't. Those people all could have gone and voted for Bernie if they wanted. There's no idea that popular sovereignty, that like democracy means first past the post, you know, like plurality wins among a large field.
Yeah.
There's no rule that like that's the way democracy has to happen.
Right. Yeah.
You know, like that's the way the Republicans do it, but there's no rule that is good. That's how they selected Mitt Romney. He won like 30-something% of the vote, and then won because the rest of the vote was split between a whole bunch of like worse people. And like,
so that's a matter of them choosing not to drop out, right? You know, I mean, that's how they ended up with Trump.
It is, but
right?
the point is that after those people dropped out, you can have the DNC call Buttigieg and be like, Buttigieg, you're not going to win. Just drop out. Yeah. You're young. You have your whole career ahead of you. Drop out now. And he did. That's what happened. Yeah. And so then, but the point is that nobody made Buttigieg voters go for Biden. And in fact, there had been a strong argument that Buttigieg voters would go for Bernie instead, and they could have. No one was twisting their arm. And so Bernie failed to drive a surge of turnout. The entire turnout surge was Biden. Bernie turnout like fell. Bernie underperformed significantly. His coalition was less diverse than it was the first time. Although he did add Latino voters, he lost a lot of different kinds of voters. Black voters went decisively against Bernie. It's like, can you really win the Democratic nomination over the heads of like 75% of black voters? Can you really do that? Like, is that cool? Would that have been like a legitimacy to the Democratic Party had Bernie won over the heads of 75% of black voters?
Yeah.
I don't think it would have. I think there would have been bitterness. There would have been like, and the point is he didn't get the votes. It was a free election. Okay, I could go on about this all day.
Sure, but that's one part of the triad of issues.
Yeah, just this obsession with power politicking.
Yeah.
Another thing is this sort of like weird wink Overton window shifting thing where like, you know, they'll come out and say, all right, we want this extremely extreme policy, and people are like, okay, wow, extreme. And then, you know, AOC will kind of go, well, actually, we'd probably compromise to the public option.
Is that not an effective negotiating strategy?
I mean, like, would it be for wages if I went in and said, well, you know what? I demand $1 million. And they're like, guy, how about like $80,000? And I'm like, 2 million. Like, there's this idea that the Overton window works as in it's this very linear median voter brain kind of thing where like if I make a bigger demand, I get more stuff in the end.
Yeah.
Like
And you're saying that's just not
true.
I mean, but
Sometimes that works.
What's the harm in asking? I mean, why start?
Because people think you're nuts and ignore you and write you off.
No,
you're like
fair point.
Because then people just write you off and say, well, you know what? You're asking so much. We're just going to make sure you never win.
I guess it just seems like though what you're saying is sort of.
Well, what are they going to get? They asked for the moon, and what are they going to get now?
Yeah. All right.
Anything?
Yeah. I mean, I guess
they can't even keep Neera Tanden out of some bureaucratic position no one cares about.
Wasn't Neera Tanden, I may be misinformed here, wasn't she the second choice after this, I think another fellow, Bruce?
Another guy they hated.
Yeah, Bruce, he was like, Neera Tanden was like better than the previous choice, right?
Well,
right?
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't even know how OMB is really that important.
Yeah.
I mean, it does a lot of functions, but I'm not sure it has that much discretionary power. I don't know. Point being, like, the fact that these guys hate Neera Tanden so much and they couldn't even keep her out of the Biden team means they got frozen out. They got shut out. In terms of healthcare, healthcare is a big important issue and we need to solve it as soon as we can.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be a priority and nothing like their plan is going to get passed. And the fact that they kept yelling about Medicare for all or something like that, I don't think that's ultimately going to make even a public option more likely to pass. I think their Overton Windows shifting strategy might have worked on some things, but I think on a lot of things it didn't work. Like I think it did work on I think abolish ICE.
Yeah.
Abolish ICE did actually pull the Overton window in an effective way. Yeah. But less by like this insane opening negotiation bid and more just highlighting abuses in the immigration system, highlighting the bad things ICE was doing, and creating this meme of an idea of abolish ICE. I think that worked. And again, I mean, but that was also like, Sean McElwee, who the socialists hate. Anyway, I don't know, like about the Green New Deal, I don't think, I think that sort of evaporated.
Well, can I ask you one, I guess, to try and take their side of this? Was that really, the fact that they've been sort of frozen out so far, is that a reflection of, I guess, bad tactics? Or is that a reflection of, look, the Democratic Party is subject and beholden to a lot of corporate influence?
Maybe. But to be honest, I think what it is that like, when you, like, the Biden administration doesn't want people who have knives out for the Biden administration on its team. So I guess that's more point one, rather not the Overton window thing. It's more just about this politicking, stabby politics thing. Like, if I were the Biden administration, even if I wanted like some super ultra left progressives, I wouldn't want those ones. Yeah. Because those are the people who are obsessed with stabbing me.
Yeah, I can understand that.
I don't want that near to me. Like it's like et tu, Brute. Like, you don't want the people who are out to knife you on your team.
Yeah, stabbies get out.
Yeah, right.
Now, before I ask you for the third element of this triad, because I'm very curious.
China.
What do you mean?
There's this emerging tankiness, if you know what tankies are.
Oh, yeah. Well, now, I thought about, them, and I did a meme about them today. But, I mean, that's not really anything meaningful off of Twitter, is it?
I hope not.
Hope not. I mean, I guess for a while, maybe that the right-wing stuff we're currently seeing right now maybe was nothing except nonsense on Twitter. And now, Trump is...
Nonsense has a way of becoming real from Twitter. Like, that's Trump. Trump is Twitter nonsense that became real.
Yeah, he's literally he's a Facebook comment string come to life.
Right, and Facebook. The Republican Party, but really Twitter, because when the Republican Party and Fox News tried to freeze him out in 2016, he went on Twitter and rallied an army against them, and that's how he won. Yeah, it was Twitter, not even Facebook. Man, it's the engine of extremist shit.
Man, well, that's spooky. Let me ask you, Noah. I know my hour with you is up. Can I keep you for another 15 minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Because I wanted to ask you. I guess I wanted to start with some of the questions from our audience here. And folks, if you have questions beyond the ones I'm going to ask that folks shared, please let me know. First of all, this sort of goes, I guess, goes off of the question about socialism and sort of an ascendant left. As a neoliberal shill, I know the man who more than anyone brought me over to interest in this side of public policy was Milton Friedman and his old Free to Choose series. And while I don't pretend
Well, how old
to
are you?
hold all that. Well, I didn't watch it when it came out in 1980.
Okay,
but I
think
watched
you're that
it
old.
I watched it on YouTube.
I'm not even that old.
Yeah, and it's still it still holds up. It's still pretty good, I think. I don't subscribe to all of it, but how well do you think his ideas have held up over time? I know that, for example, I saw a lot of editorials recently saying that he was dead wrong about shareholder theory, where basically his idea of the corporation, where its only job is basically to deliver value to shareholders. So, I mean, I've been seeing a lot of criticism of him. I mean, a lot of what we've talked about tonight, I imagine he would find, awful. But this is a guy who is the most influential economist, some might say, or at least top two influential economist in the 20th century, right? So, do you think his ideas have held up? Was he wrong about anything? I mean,
Yeah, sure, he's wrong about a lot of stuff.
okay,
I mean, then again, it's hard to find someone who's right about everything.
yeah.
Economics is it's an imprecise science, and it used to be even more imprecise. Like, you just put out these big ideas. Milton Friedman, I mean, there were things he just didn't take into account. So, like, one of the things that everybody loves that Milton Friedman said, he was against the draft.
Yeah.
Who likes the draft? And yet, now our culture is fragmenting, and people in like red and blue states or areas don't even meet each other and talk to each other. Maybe having a bunch of random people join the army was actually a way of binding our country together, and maybe the end of that is one reason why our country is coming apart more. I don't know the answer to that, but I think Milton Friedman didn't either, and he didn't really think about it. So, but that's like one of his most popular positions. Shareholder value, even if your object is long-term shareholder value, short-termism can be a thing, and there's arguments that giving managers some power lengthens the horizon of the company, so the company builds up size in the short term and creates value in the long term. There's some arguments about that. Again, I see people argue back and forth about short-termism.
Yeah. As for the draft, I mean, even if you could demonstrate that it had a positive influence on like social cohesion, you wouldn't advocate. I can't imagine advocating for the draft and saying this degree of compulsion is okay because social cohesion.
So like, I don't know. I mean, they do it in South Korea. They do it in Singapore. Isn't that the freest society in the world? Singapore. They do it in Singapore. They do it in South Korea. Until relatively recently, they did it in Germany. Maybe, I don't remember, 10 years ago, something, or something. They canceled it in Germany, but they had it during the whole Cold War. A lot of countries have this universal service. Maybe that helps social cohesion. And we always had this thing. We were like, okay, instead of sending people into the military, let's send people to do civilian stuff. Let's have AmeriCorps. Let's have this national service thing. Sure. It never really got off the ground. Military gets support in a way that other stuff doesn't politically.
That's true.
And so, like, when you look at how the experience of World War II, we didn't desegregate Black and Japanese people, but we did desegregate Chinese people, Mexican people, everybody except Black and Japanese people, and of course, like, Italian and Polish people and Jewish people and stuff like that. And I think you had a more cohesive country after World War II than you did before, in part because of the experience of fighting together in those units in World War II and going through that. Of course, maybe civilian draft, just like civilian service, doesn't do that as much because you don't fight alongside people. Instead, you just get hazed. I don't know. So the fact is, I don't know, but I see our country coming apart, and I reached in my mind for things that made our country more united in the past. And I think, what could stop us? What could bring us to this juncture? Because if the point is to avoid government restrictions of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
then you want a cohesive country that can sort of all agree on that. Or else if your country starts coming apart, at some point, someone's going to try to arrest that with some very inadvisable government actions.
So
So if your
I see
goal
what
is to
you're saying.
maximize not just today's liberty, but liberty forever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think ultimately the libertarian movement, including Nozick, everybody got wrong.
Hmm.
They thought about short-term liberties because I guess they were thinking deontologically. They were thinking of like, what do I refuse to let the government do to me today?
Mm-hmm.
But then they didn't think in this terms of present value, in this terms of like looking forward across all of history and thinking, what will maximize the liberty of the society, not just today, but tomorrow and the next day and the next century as
Mm-hmm.
well. And I think that failure to look forward really hurt that movement intellectually.
I see. I mean, that's something I've certainly been curious about is, the kind of society that can make freedom durable,
Right.
because it continues to exist. Like if the United States is maximally free, but it is free in such a way that cannot continue to exist, then it is, it's
Right.
temporary.
Exactly. In economics, we have this consumption investment trade-off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do I party or work hard? Do I save or spend? Do I do all these things? And I feel like the libertarian movement encouraged consumption of liberty with no savings
Mm-hmm.
in terms of things like building public goods, just like, the zeal to like and reduce taxes and reduce spending and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what if we don't have like infrastructure and research and these things like that? Will our economy slow down and fall behind tomorrow?
Yeah.
And then, at that point, will even bigger restrictions on freedom gain currency and credence. So I think,
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like one of the ways that I personally justify, I guess, a social welfare state in some ways, at least, is that I don't like I have a hard time thinking about things as rights, like deliverable goods. But I can envision them as like, this is necessary so that we have a stable society that we can have durable kind of freedom in, as opposed to a society that just kind of dissolves or falls apart. Maybe that suffers economic calamity that then brings in an appetite for more government. Like,
yeah,
I guess like
save us, dictator.
yeah, exactly. Like the Great Depression, where you had, we never had what they had in Germany, but we did have some people during especially the first years of the Roosevelt administration calling for either a temporary dictator or something approaching that.
Right.
And
I would argue that, people are all, like when I said FDR was a neoliberal, I got absolutely flamed.
sure, yeah.
Not just by historians of FDR,
Yeah.
like historians flamed me,
Yeah.
and then neoliberals flamed me because they didn't want FDR on their team, and pro FDR people flamed me because they didn't want FDR called a neoliberal. And in the end, FDR created not just the political preconditions, but also the actual system that made the United States more of a free marketplace than Europe, than other rich countries, for better and for worse.
Yeah.
Right, with healthcare, whatever. For better and for worse, these things came out of FDR. So FDR insisted on a non-fully funded system for Social Security. He insisted on deficit hawkery sometimes in 37. It was a big mistake. But he insisted on doing a lot of things through companies, through private business, through markets, in a way that set us up to not be as socialistic as other countries. And part of it came from necessity because business was powerful, but part of it was just because FDR himself was had free market pro-business instincts. Yeah. And so when I say that he was a neoliberal, people are like, fuck you, Noah, full of shit. And I'm like, well, I'm sticking to my guns on this one. FDR was functionally, and in some ways even ideologically, neoliberal.
There you go. I like how we started with Milton Friedman and got to FDR.
Got to FDR, right? So that, so Milton Friedman, he built a system where everything kind of fit together and made sense. People love those worldviews that fit together and make sense. But in a way, it's like a package deal, right? If some of the stuff is bad, some of the stuff is good, you have to buy the bad just to get the good. Yeah. And so I feel like that was the kind of thing that Milton Friedman, but also a lot of other Chicago school people and econo-libertarians at the time were selling. It's this this thing where you have to buy the bad with the good.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you some questions about more sort of to the left. So somebody in here, C the Communist, is asking, Biden running on a public option, which was a part of his plan. Is that due to that kind of Overton window pulling? If Bernie had not crawled with Medicare for all, could Biden have walked with an Overton window or with a public option?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is that we don't know.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, it could just be that voters were mad as hell about healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
They were mad about the deficiencies of Obamacare. Mm-hmm. They were mad about the fact that Obamacare was cancelable. Mm-hmm. They wanted more, and they realized that more is needed. And so that is what pushed just people to call for a public option stuff.
Okay.
The idea that Biden had to do a public option as a hedge against Bernie, mm-hmm. I hope that's wrong. Because if that's right, then what it means is that he's going to drop that public option and defer it and not actually try to do it.
Mm-hmm. Now that, like you were saying,
in other words, running on a public option doesn't mean you actually try to do a public option. It just means you say it.
Yeah.
But like you can say, well, you know what? We have other priorities. Mm-hmm. And like you can put it on the back burner, and you can, like, people run on all kinds of things they end up never doing. Trump ran on infrastructure week.
We're still waiting for it. We've still got a month and change for an infrastructure week, right?
I know. And so, like, the idea that did Biden run on a public option because Bernie made him? Maybe. Will Biden do a public option because Bernie made him?
So I guess we'll know.
I'm optimistic. Of course, there's a Republican Congress.
Yeah.
Who knows why?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
The answer is I don't know.
What about, let me ask you about worker co-ops. So one thing I've heard from folks, especially on the left, is that basically this new idea of socialism, any way you slice it, really starts with a democratic workplace, and I guess the central to that would be something like a worker cooperative. And we have a small but relatively durable share of businesses in the United States that are worker co-ops. I think it's somewhere around 7%. And so Revolt Rise, here, appropriately named, says, why should we basically not be forcing this issue a little better or a little more? Why not level the field for worker co-ops? Why not force corporations that needed bailouts to adopt a worker co-op model? I mean, why are we sitting on the fence? Shouldn't employees get a vote?
Well, so it's really interesting. Worker co-ops definitely have some big benefits to them. And so there's difficulties with worker co-ops is like when you get your shares, when your shares get sold, mm-hmm. where the shares come from. It can be difficult for worker co-ops to grow. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. So worker co-ops have trouble growing because you need capital to grow. Theoretically, you could have all the workers agree to like raise the capital, but then they get diluted and it's weird and people don't know how to handle their, being stockholders in their own company. There's a lot of ins and outs. I do like worker co-ops, but I think that there are other things that intermediate steps we can do that sort of get at that some of the way. And one of those, for example, is co-determination, which is an idea that Warren and then Bernie mm-hmm. Brought up during the primaries. This idea of, basically having workers elect people to have corporate control, mm-hmm. partial corporate control. So that gets you some of the democracy in terms of management, right? You feel like you have the stake, you have this power. There's evidence that co-determination improves productivity. And one way is because the worker representatives actually, they're close to people on the shop floor or whatever you have, office, whatever, that, and so they're close to the actual management problems, so they can help set the direction for the whole company, knowing what the company's capabilities and challenges are. So there's evidence for that in like Germany or countries where they have it. So co-determination, good idea. We won't do it. We're going to forget about it. Nobody cares. It's a good idea. We should keep it around for when we can do it. A second idea is to pay people much more bonuses. And I'm not talking about commission. I'm talking about annual bonuses based on the performance of the company, which is what they do in Japan. And if you think about it, bonuses are Well, it's not quite exactly the same as stock ownership, because instead you're not getting paid. You're not like a shareholder. You're not getting paid out of profits. You're actually getting paid out of revenue.
Right.
And so the late Martin Weitzman, the economist who just died, had this whole book about why paying bonuses out of revenue was great, because it actually eliminated cyclical unemployment as well as giving people a stake in the company. But basically, paying people more bonuses and more yearly bonuses and less base salary is a way to get some of the ownership, and you pay it out of revenue. And so that's some of the way to get more. It's sort of like a simulation of ownership, except you don't have to deal with like the owning the stock and like being a shareholder and blah blah. So, but if you have co-determination and bonuses, you get pretty close to the ideal of worker co-ops without having to rearrange your financial structure so much, and you still have the ability for the actual shareholders to like raise new capital and grow the company.
But it sounds like, though, you don't want to force the issue.
I would, but I mean, we're going to have trouble getting like vaccine funding past Mitch McConnell.
Is that really the only objection, though, you'd have to like saying, every company, just if you could snap your fingers, would you make every company into a worker co-op?
Into a worker co-op? No, because the growth problem into this kind of system with co-determination and bonuses.
Yeah.
I would give it incentives. So what I would do is I would have, like say, okay, you pay lower taxes if you have this structure. Let's incentivize people to start adopting the structure and see how it turns out.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see if these actually are more productive, if workers do feel more invested and feel better.
Yeah.
There could be reasons why workers don't want this. The bonus system might create uncertainty that they didn't like. Co-determination people might be like, I don't want to screw with this. I think it would work well, but I think it's worth trying out. I mean, like, we've seen countries that have it. Germany has it, has co-determination. Germany has co-determination. Japan has the bonus system. It's time to take a clue from some of these other countries here.
Yeah. Okay.
Try some things.
All right. Let me ask you, we've got a question here from Touring News, who's another streamer here on the platform. He's a great guy if you ever want to check out his content.
Awesome.
Yeah, he does a great stream. He says, at the beginning of COVID-19, he says South Korea banned short selling for 6 months, then expanded it for another 6 months to prevent people from speculating down and crashing the markets. I haven't heard anything about this, but I guess I want to ask you, how do you feel about this, as well as stricter controls or outright bans on stock buybacks?
Banning short selling is pointless. Short selling works against bubbles. Never ban short selling. Stock buybacks, I've seen pretty good evidence that stock buybacks actually don't do anything.
Like banning stock buybacks or
just the practice of, like the practice of stock buybacks is irrelevant. It's stock buybacks are a fancy dividend that has slightly better tax treatment.
Oh. Okay. So
banning stock buybacks doesn't do much. Some of the arguments against stock buyback are wrong. Some are just like incoherent. Some are right, but like just don't matter that much. So stock buybacks, I could go into it and talk your ear off more, but I would say it's not a biggie. It's not a big deal. The real problem is how managers are compensated in this country. There's a Milton Friedman mistake. The idea that managers should be a bunch of shareholders. And what's the issue with that? Oh, the issue is the short-termism. The issue is that managers, they're not going to work for this company forever. Yeah. They want to pump up the stock price and get out.
I see. That makes sense.
And that means not investing for the future, investing for the future raises wages and hiring. Yeah. Instead, they're just like, give me the money, I'm out.
In fact, do you think it would be fair to say that maybe the average shareholder, not a managerial shareholder, is more long-term inclined, but the active, the managers themselves who are thinking about this perhaps more short-term are more like, I guess, do you think that short-termism is a result of that managerial compensation as opposed to?
I think so. I think, yes. Okay. I'm not sure, but I think, because I'm not sure how much short-termism there really is. I've seen evidence both ways, but I think that if there is short-termism, compensating managers in like stock options and stuff does kind of add to it. Yeah. Managers have a large I mean, if you have like eternal lockup, so basically like the Silicon Valley compensation system,
Mm-hmm.
so like even after you leave, you're going to have to keep this stock around forever and be
Yeah.
undiversified.
Ah.
Yeah, maybe so, but that's not how we do it.
Are you concerned at all, speaking of Silicon Valley, are you concerned at all about these big tech companies, Amazon? I mean, I know that the federal government is starting to look, I guess because conservatives have been banned from Twitter, they're starting to reconsider. They're starting to reconsider antitrust laws. I mean, does any of that concern you? Do you, or do you think that really the pandemic has shown that companies like Amazon basically, without them, we'd have been, between Amazon
Absolutely,
and
we
Zoom,
would have
we
been
wouldn't have been able
absolutely
to.
screwed without Amazon.
Yeah.
I mean, Amazon, Google, they've been incredibly useful during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Antitrust doesn't necessarily solve the problems people actually have with some of these tech companies.
Yeah.
So like the problem of fake news, it doesn't matter if you split Instagram off from Facebook, that's not going to stop fake news. That doesn't mean a damn thing.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's a good thing to do. Maybe Instagram and Facebook, if they were split up, would compete with each other for ads or something.
Mm-hmm.
But like, and then drive down the price of advertising for like struggling newspapers. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like the things people really are upset at Facebook about,
Mm-hmm.
like fake news, right-wing propaganda, privacy violations, selling your data to people, all this stuff, antitrust is never going to beat any of that.
Yeah.
It's just not going to, it's neither here nor there. And so I think that people should think about, so I think that in some ways, forcing Facebook to split off from Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, would be just an alpha power move on the part of the government. I'm actually about to write this for Bloomberg.
Oh, wow.
It's a power move. It's saying we can split you up. Government is in charge. Company not in charge.
Oh, I see.
It's like bring your dog to heel. It's like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like it's discipline.
That's so frustrating, though. Like, if you're gonna enforce the law, okay, enforce the law. But just waving your power around, that feels like basically the more professional version of what President Trump brags about doing when he says, I called up Ford and I told them to do what I said and they did it. That's like, we don't want government that's in that business, do we? It's frustrating. Okay, so I've got, can I ask you 2 more questions? Okay, all right. 2 more questions. So my first question here is COVID response. Do you think some countries have done a really good job? South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. I mean, if you believe the Chinese Communist Party, China has done a pretty good job controlling a disease that originated there.
New Zealand,
Australia. And it's not just, rich countries. Not only China, Vietnam has apparently done a good job controlling COVID-19. A developing country that has nevertheless shown up the United States, Thailand. Meanwhile, in Europe and in the United States in particular, it's there's no word for it other than catastrophe. Did it have to be this way? Is our kind of, is there something about America that just meant one way or another we were never going to go for the kind of measures that South Korea and other countries have found successful? Or could we have done better?
I don't know. Have you ever heard of the high-level equilibrium trap?
No, I haven't.
Well, it's this idea that a lot of societies in the agricultural age that were actually richer and more stable and successful, like China, India, these societies stagnated during the 1500s, 1600s or whatever, because things were going so well, especially for the leaders, they didn't see a need to change when industrial technology came along. They didn't. It's an argument. I don't know if it's right.
Sure.
But when I think about America, I think about the high-level equilibrium trap. When I think about Europe too, I think here we have these rich consumer societies where people are used to going out and doing all their stuff. Remember that woman who just shrieked her head off about lockdown? She's like, I have to give up every form of pleasure. It's like, shut up, you're going to die. Like your parents. Every form of pleasure, get back in your house.
Yeah.
But the point is that people couldn't and wouldn't because our system is fragile and our system is rich.
Yeah.
We have these consumption patterns that are where we go out to eat and we have a lot of fun and we do all the and drink and whatnot and go to parties and it's so fun, right? And then but when we have to give it up, it's like our lives collapse. We just couldn't handle it. We couldn't handle the restrictions of like staying home, and so we didn't. We half-assed the lockdowns, and we did a few, and they were somewhat effective. And then but we disobeyed the ones that we even did.
Yeah, they're so patchwork.
I say, and like European countries did stricter lockdowns for sure. But we didn't do centralized quarantine. We didn't do mandatory contact tracing. We didn't do travel restrictions. Like, these countries that got it right went to war economy. They were just like, okay, war, travel restrictions, centralized quarantine. You have COVID, you go to quarantine now. They immediately just forced supply chains to do what they need to do to get the tests, right? They immediately forced hotels to set up these centralized quarantines. They forced people to stay home even. They checked relentlessly who people had been in contact with. They implemented harsh travel restrictions. None of these things we did. We did so much half-assed stuff. We just screeched each other. And we couldn't give up restaurant meals, and so hundreds of thousands of people died. Man. We couldn't give up these things. High-level equilibrium trap. Our system was too good in the good times to be willing to make the adjustments in the bad times. That's the only guess I have.
Yeah. I have to check that out because that's really interesting. All right. So my last question I want to ask you is maybe something, it could be maybe a positive outgrowth of the experience of the last year. What about, how do you feel about the prospect of a universal basic income? The $1,200 checks, were, of course, that kind of stimulus program is very popular, but
I like it.
Understandably so. But
I like it.
It seems like between between the stimulus that we've had, I don't know that why couldn't we just continue such a program like that in normal times?
We could.
Do you think there are any drawbacks to that? Would you prefer, how do you feel about a federal jobs guarantee typically proposed, I guess, as the alternative?
I don't think the jobs guarantee is going to be good. Things like it, works provision or whatever in recessions can be good. Yeah. But I think that the job guarantee would quickly turn into this political football, and you'd have massive screeching Twitter fights over every person that got fired for doing meth on the job. Yeah. And they'd keep forcing the wages and benefits up until everyone went from private sector jobs to effectively make work where you could show up, get great wages and do meth. And I think it in principle would be an interesting idea, but in practices would be a disaster.
Yeah. I just
UBI, not that.
Yeah.
At some point it's just give people a UBI.
That seems harder to screw up. I know when the federal job guarantee proponents come out, I'm just thinking, do you want to have your welfare payment subject to whether you work on Trump's wall? Right. All right. I do have
UBI
to,
good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to hear.
I'm on the UBI side against job guarantee. So.
All right. The last thing I have to ask is, how are you feeling about Jerome Powell lurking on your Twitter?
He should subscribe to my Substack.
That's a good answer. Noah, thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight. I kept you for a full half hour beyond what we agreed. So thank you so much for that. It was just so interesting talking with you. So I really do appreciate that. And folks can find you on Twitter, on your Substack, and Bloomberg Opinion.
And Bloomberg Opinion, always.
We'll drop links to that as well. No, I hope you enjoyed it. It was so much fun talking with you tonight.
I did. I'll come back sometime. Thanks.
Right on. Good stuff. Thank you so much. Here for what I believe is his Twitch debut, Noah Smith. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Good night.